It's the greatest race in human history. It will tilt the balance of international power. It will create fortunes of colossal scale, and destroy them too. It will upend communities and whole civilizations in every part of the planet, and push some of them into a fight for survival. And it's already begun. Join me on a journey through a changing planet, meeting the people in the front lines of the climate crisis, and the changes that it sent cascading through the modern world. From indigenous people in the Brazilian Amazon, battling against the destruction of their rainforest by illegal cattle farming, to the startup venture in Iceland that's sucking carbon dioxide from the air and turning it into underground stone. We'll see how rising oceans are devastating island villages in the South Pacific, while driving a vast wave of migration in Bangladesh. And how Greenland's vanishing ice is promising an economic boom, even as it threatens the ancient traditions of its ice hunters. From Guangzhou to Silicon Valley, we'll meet tycoons fighting for pole position in the market for electric cars, and the Congolese miners risking their lives to dig up the minerals for the batteries that power them. Across the world, we'll see how climate change is throwing some of the planet's most powerful industries into turmoil, as an army of high-powered startups scrambles to make billions by taking their place. It's a cast of characters from every walk of life and every corner of the globe, all of them playing their part in the biggest story of the century.
Obrigado. Bom dia a todos. É realmente prazer estar de volta na fantástica cidade de Lisboa. And what an amazing venue to be having this discussion in. So I thought it would be good to discuss a few of the most important stories and takeaways that I encountered during my research for this book, Race for Tomorrow. I'm not actually a climate journalist by background. I'm a foreign correspondent. I worked in South Africa and then South Korea and then in India. And it was soon after my arrival in Mumbai that I really got switched on to this subject. I had heard about terrible drought happening in the west of the country, and I took an overnight train out to this area, Marathwada, where farmers had been suffering in a very serious way. I saw fields that were devoid of any living crops, reservoirs empty of water. And it really struck me for the first time in such a serious way just how immediate and urgent this problem is. I think, like many of us, I'd often thought about climate change in terms of the future, in terms of things that would happen in 2050 or 2100. But I realized just how immediate this problem is for people all over the world today. And it was around that time that I also started to awaken to just how big the consequences of this were going to be for the global economy. As journalists, I think we'd often treated climate change as being something at the margins of the big political or big economic stories. But now, from global business to global policy, finance, culture, really every area you care to look at, this, I realized, was at the very center of the subject, simply the biggest story in the world today. And yet, for many people, it can be difficult to engage with this subject. The complex science of climate change, the incredible changes that we're going to have to make to our energy system as a result. This is really one of the biggest events that's ever happened in the history of civilization. Since the Industrial Revolution, we have been living in the fossil fuel age. It's been a period of unprecedented gains in economic prosperity, in terms of longevity, in terms of living standards. All of this built upon a foundation of fossil fuels, something that we have now realized we're going to have to move beyond as quickly as possible. And so in order to address this in a way that would cut through the abstraction and the complexity, enable people to really grapple with the incredible color and humanity of this story, I decided to take a sort of old-fashioned reporter's approach I realized this would require a journey to meet people who were really on the front lines of these shifts, both in terms of people who are suffering from the impacts of climate change and those who are driving the extraordinary transformation of our energy system that will be required in response. And so I set out on a journey that ended up taking 2 years through 26 countries all over the world, meeting an extraordinary range of people with an extraordinary range of stories, and I'd like to share some of those stories with you today. When people ask me what the most extraordinary of all the places that I visited was, I usually come back to Mongolia. This gentleman behind me is Gombo. I took this photograph of him with his animals in Uvs, which is in the northwest of Mongolia. This is one of the most counterfactual impacts, or counterintuitive impacts of climate change, that it's actually driving much more severe winter conditions in many parts of the world. We saw this, for example, a couple of years ago in Texas. We see these shifts in moisture and heat energy in the northern hemisphere that are driven by the melting of ice in the Arctic. And for people like Gombo, this is creating very severe conditions for the animals. As you can see, they're struggling to find food to eat. And it's just one example of something that I encountered all over the world, which is just how disproportionately the effects of climate change are being borne by those who are least prosperous and those who have contributed the least to the problem. Ali Mohammed here on the left in the northeast of Ethiopia has similarly been suffering terrible losses to his livestock as a result of years of droughts followed by locust infestations, all linked to the impacts of climate change. In the Solomon Islands, I met Gandhi, who actually in this photograph is standing on the site of his former home, which has now been inundated by sea level rise that is happening as a result of changes in trade winds at a faster pace in the Solomon Islands, but a level at which the rest of the world should be prepared for. Morgina here on the right in Bangladesh, who grew up in the southwest of the country, an area that is becoming increasingly unsustainable to pursue rice farming in, the traditional and long-standing livelihood for people in that region. And she, like many hundreds of thousands of others, has been forced to the slums of Bangladesh. And time again, it really comes back to this issue, which you see on the placard here, held by Joanna Sustento. And when I met her here, she was outside the Philippines headquarters of Shell, and she was holding a one-woman protest in memory of the more than 6,000 people in her hometown of Tacloban who were killed in Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, including almost every member of her family. And the reason why she chose the headquarters of Shell was because in the year before her protests, Shell had paid out more money in dividends to its shareholders than any other company in the world, $20 billion, far ahead of second place Apple, and its chief executive earned $62,000 per day. And Joanna will tell you that the reason why this is possible was because Shell was not paying the costs of the pollution that was stemming from the use of its products. Those costs were being borne by people all over the world, including the people of Tacloban. And this question of climate justice was at the very top of the agenda, of course, at last year's COP27, which I attended. And the result of that conference was, I think, frustrating for many who were there. By the standards of COPs, which have often resulted in very little progress, I think one could see it as a relatively successful one. The agreement on, in principle, a fund for loss and damage to cover the costs that are being borne by countries such as this was a step forward. But by the standards of what is required to really address these problems, it obviously fell far short. Because what we are actually talking about here is a fundamental reshaping of our energy systems. And that's something which was a core part of my research for the book. It brought me into contact with people like this gentleman, Prince Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia, who's the energy minister of that country and as such effectively the most powerful person in the global oil industry. And Abdulaziz is the older brother of Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who of course became notorious over the grisly murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And this is a country which at COP27, as at previous COPs, has been widely blamed for seeking to hold back the pace of progress towards that transformation of the energy industry. What struck me in my conversation with Abdulaziz was the sort of evolution of the Saudi perspective, the fact that even Saudi Arabia cannot ignore the way that the winds of change are blowing in the energy industry. Abdulaziz was saying things like Saudi Arabia will be the last man standing in the global oil business. It's true that they have the lowest cost of production, more or less, and the lowest associated emissions with the extraction of oil. But the game that he was talking was very much on the clean energy potential of the country. Hydrogen in particular, the development of blue hydrogen, which involves creating hydrogen from natural gas while capturing and storing the carbon, the green hydrogen potential of that country, enormous solar resource, obviously. And it was something which I would treat with a fair dose of skepticism, but at the same time, I think one cannot take too lightly the position that countries like that are taking. And it's going to be extremely interesting later this year to see what happens with the hosting of COP28 in the United Arab Emirates. Recently, I had a conversation with the incoming president of that country, of that conference, Sultan Al Jaber. And the Emiratis are talking a very big game on the need for this to be a transformational COP, one that will really achieve a lot of progress. There's been very understandable criticism of the decision to appoint the serving head of the National Oil Company as the president of that COP. It's interesting to me, because that was certainly my first response also, it's interesting for me to hear from some fairly thoughtful people the idea that by bringing countries like that to the center of the conversation, by putting them on the spot, we might have an opportunity to drive forward progress by really putting them in a corner they cannot back out of. But the thing that really drove my sense of optimism during my research for the book was the startups that I encountered from all over the world who are driving forward incredible technological advances to tackle some of the biggest challenges that we see in the world today around the climate crisis. This photo I took with a drone in Iceland at the Hellisheiði geothermal power plant, which is the biggest geothermal plant in Iceland. And it's where Edda Aradóttir is leading a project that's quite unlike any other that I've encountered. It's a joint venture between her company, Carbfix, and Climeworks, which is a startup that grew out of two entrepreneurs studying at ETH Zurich in Switzerland. And what they have built here is a system to suck carbon dioxide from the air, turn it into soda water, effectively, dissolving it in water, pump it underground, where it reacts with the volcanic basalt under the Icelandic soil to create limestone. So you are effectively reversing the the cycle through which we have taken these substances from underground, burned them, turned them into gas, just putting that into reverse, putting it underground where, unlike a lot of carbon capture and storage schemes, the carbon will actually become solid and inert for a very long time to come. But there's an issue here, or there's a couple of issues that come to mind immediately. The first is the cost. Carbon offsets, as you've probably seen, are often very cheap, and this is because very often they're linked to projects to protect forests. The offsets that this joint venture sells are extremely expensive by comparison, and without tighter standards around carbon offsetting, tighter systems around carbon pricing in general, it'll be difficult to drive a market for this. And the other challenge that they face is the amount of energy that's going to be required to drive these systems. And this is something which you really see right across the scope of technologies that need to be deployed here. Last week I was in Sweden visiting one of the most interesting green steel plants in the world at the moment. Steel, without fixing steel, we cannot fix the climate crisis. It's about 7% of global carbon emissions. It comes, of course, from blast furnaces. We burn coking coal in a blast furnace where the carbon reacts with the oxygen in the iron ore to give off CO2. And this is at the very center of the modern economy, from the cars we drive to the buildings we live in. In Sweden, last week, I saw the first plant that's been built where instead of using coal, they use hydrogen, which reacts with the oxygen in the iron ore to form water, which sounds brilliant. But again, the amount of energy that will be required here is going to be extraordinary. LKAB, Sweden's biggest iron ore miner and the biggest indeed in the EU, says that by 2050, to decarbonize its operations, it will require 70 terawatt hours of power per year. For comparison, the current total electricity consumption of Sweden is 130 terawatt hours. So that's an idea of the scale that we are looking at. It's important to remember that tackling the climate crisis is not only about the energy sector. This company, Aleph Farms, their chief executive, Didier Toubia, I met in Israel, in Rehovot, outside Tel Aviv. And they're putting together a system to generate cell-based meat in bioreactors, which sounds outlandish and spooky to many. But, of course, beef farming in particular is one of the biggest drivers of deforestation in the Amazon and elsewhere. And cattle, we have more than 1 billion cattle in the world today, giving off huge amounts of methane. So this could be an important part of the climate crisis response. But it is, first and foremost, the innovation and transformation in the energy sector that will decide the future of the modern economy and the future of the planet that it depends on. This is He Xiaopeng, who I met in Guangzhou, where his company, XPeng Motors, is based. And he actually made his first billion not in the clean energy sector, but in software. He developed an app called UC Browser, which was China's most popular smartphone browser. It was acquired by Alibaba, and Xiaopeng found himself as a senior executive at Alibaba, which was then by far the most successful e-commerce company in China, given subsequent events with Jack Ma's falling out with the Communist Party. Perhaps Xiaopeng made the right decision in choosing to go for clean energy, and in particular, electric cars. And what struck me in my conversations in China with people like Xiaopeng, with other Chinese clean tech entrepreneurs, was their level of confidence in the alignment of their business strategy with the national economic strategy of the Chinese government. Clearly, China is by far the world's biggest carbon emitter today, still building coal-fired power stations, and there's no question that that is a big part of the challenge that we face. But in the long term, my conversations in China added to the sense that I have that this is really something that China is committed to, not necessarily in the interest of the planet, but in the interest of the national economy. China is already in pole position in so many areas of the clean tech economy, from electric cars to solar panel production. And this is a challenge for the rest of the world. Of course, the global solar industry is heavily reliant at so many parts of the solar supply chain on the province of Xinjiang, where there have been well-documented human rights abuses. And this is a challenge that the solar industry is struggling with at the moment, to reduce this level of dependence on the Chinese economy. But it's something which, if you are an ambitious entrepreneur in China and you want to pursue something which is going to have decades of growth ahead, it seems that this is second to none in terms of that growth potential. In the US, I saw a very different sort of startup scene. This is Bob Mumgard, and he's posing here with a fusion reactor that was actually built at MIT in the 1980s. It's called the Alcator CMOD. And when it was switched on, it actually contained the hottest point of the entire solar system, several times hotter than the center of the sun. But the problem was that in order to generate that amount of heat, it required so much electricity that they had to switch it on by prior arrangement with the Cambridge Municipal Electricity Authority, and it consumed far more power than it could possibly generate. So pretty useless as a blueprint for a power station. But what Bob is building now in the countryside outside Massachusetts is what he claims will be a blueprint for the first working power station, fusion power station that the world has seen. This is going to be called the Spark reactor. And you could think of it almost as a smaller version of the ITER reactor in the south of France, which has been under construction for many years, which I also visited, an amazing site, but at such a huge size that it would be difficult to replicate. Using more powerful magnets, Bob Mumgard's team say that they can build these machines at a far smaller and more practical scale. And this is one of the areas that has come into hotter focus in the last few years. There are dozens of fusion startups around the world pursuing this sort of breakthrough. There was an important development in the US at a state-funded laboratory in December where a laser-powered plant generated more power out than in at one stage of the reaction. But by all accounts, we are still decades away from fusion plants playing a meaningful role in the generation of the world's electricity. And this highlights some of the questions that are posed within the race to decarbonize the economy, which don't have any easy answers. To what extent do we want to invest money in moonshots that may not pay off at all, and if they do pay off, will not pay off for decades to come? To what extent do we want to focus on rolling out the technology that we already have? This is a similar debate that comes up around carbon capture from the air, direct air capture, and it's one that you can expect to rage more and more furiously in the years ahead as more and more money gets pumped into these sorts of areas. So this was the second thing that really struck me during my travels, is how much cause for excitement there is about some of the astonishing technological breakthroughs that are being pursued and some of the progress that is being made towards them. But a third thing that that left an indelible mark on me from these travels is the realization of just how complicated this transformation of the economy will prove. Sometimes when you hear people talking about greening the economy, people will talk about it almost as though it will be easy, as though it's a matter of integrating ESG metrics or a matter of pursuing certain targets, and as though the answers are clear. But as I mentioned, with the solar supply chain in Xinjiang, there are some serious problems in the emerging green economy. This is a mine in Congo, in the southeast of the country, in a town called Kolwezi. And these miners have been heaving up sacks full of cobalt. Cobalt is used in most electric car batteries produced in the world today. It's a really central mineral in the energy transition at the moment. There are those who are trying to find ways to engineer it out and achieve high-performance batteries using different forms of chemistry. But the situation in Congo shows just how complicated the supply chain here is. I went down inside one of these mines with a miner called Mangovo, who's here holding a handful of cobalt underground. To get down there, you need to go down barefoot, like a chimney sweep. To get to the bottom, these mines are dangerous. They collapse fairly frequently. Just getting down there is a pretty sketchy experience. But I was only down there for about 15 minutes. People like Mangovo have been going down there every day for years, or indeed in some cases decades. And in some cases you've had much younger people like Letitia, who I met after she had been found and held by an NGO, which was giving her training to become a seamstress. But before that, she was working at the mines, like many children in that area of Congo. It's an extraordinary cobalt rush that you're seeing in that area. And the answer to this that some people have been focusing on is the need to eliminate child labor specifically, which of course must be an absolute top priority. Child labor is an abomination. There can be no place for it in any modern economy. But it raises much deeper and wider questions too. As we are forced to reshape our global economy from the bottom up, we simply have no choice. We've recognized we are cooking the planet and we have to stop. This is forcing us to move towards a less carbon-intensive economy. But we also have an opportunity to consider what are the wider structural problems in the modern global economy that mean that people like Letitia and Mangovo are in the first place finding themselves in such a position that they would even want to work in such dreadful conditions. And as we rethink the energy foundations of our economy, we have an opportunity to rethink much more besides, to make sure that this is going to be a better, fairer economy in every other way too. I think we have time for some questions, Pedro.
Well, I'd like to ask for a round of applause for your presentation. Simon, I'm not going to ask how many air miles you got during your trip around the world, but jokes aside, really impressive piece of work. I have to ask you, obviously, you just said, whilst you closed your presentation here, that we're cooking the planet and this needs to change. Obviously, change means different things to different people in different parts of the planet. So how ready are societies and economies around the world, and how much does this differ, ready to do that at many times an immediate cost for a long-term benefit?
Yeah, well, first of all, on the air miles thing, I think it's important to speak to that. I think one can approach the climate crisis in different ways. You can look to minimize your negative impacts or look to contribute towards the positive systemic change. So I took a call that on the ground, journalism can play a constructive role, and that was the logic behind it. But it's a matter of perspective, I think, on that. As to how ready society is, I think it's interesting to me to see, for one thing, within the business community, I don't think, the fact that Abdulaziz was feeling the need, Prince Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia was feeling the need to push this message, I think there's room for a huge amount of skepticism about it. But the fact that even Aramco, the largest energy company in the world, are feeling the need not to be seen as fossil-fueled dinosaurs is widely shared across the industry. I mean, there are exceptions. There are, of course, energy companies in the US, for example, that are fairly happy to go wholeheartedly still after fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. But there's no question the zeitgeist in business is focused increasingly on the opportunities within the green economy. And there's a lot of concern about how ready the wider public are, especially at a time of rising living pressures. And it was striking for me at COP26 in Glasgow. There were people talking about how there was more concern being shown for vulnerable populations overseas than for low-income people in the UK, in the host country. And I think this, again, speaks to the need for this to go hand in hand with a broader effort to create a fairer economy. If you look over the past 20 or 30 years, in many countries, you've seen rising inequality, the fruits of growth going disproportionately to the better off. And if this particular transition is managed in a similar way, such that the bulk of the pain is borne by the less well-off, the bulk of the rewards go to the wealthier, then in democracies you won't be able to get full support of the sort that you would need. Having said that, I'm encouraged by what I have seen in terms of opinion surveys about popular approaches towards this. Support, for example, for the loss and damage fund that will go entirely to lower income countries. There does seem to be strong support in principle for that in developed countries. So I do think there's cause for optimism there.
I did want to ask if anyone had a quick question for Simon they'd like to ask. Go for it. Rather a question from the public than another.
And thank you for your presentation. I think it was very enlightening, and especially showing the effects that this energy transition, about which we speak in sometimes so abstract ways in terms of macroeconomic goals, and you've shown the effect that it has on actual people all over the world. And I think that's the job of journalism, so thank you for that. But moving again to the macro side of it, as a European, I am concerned about the pace at which we are conducting the transition, and also about Europe's geopolitical position, because we seem to be very good whenever a problem arises in putting out really nice legislations and rules and goals, like Repower Europe and many of these European packages. But we are competing with other blocs like the US, in which they spend a lot of time discussing the laws and arguing and getting another state representative to vote for or against. They take a long time to develop those packages and aids, but then they are very fast to bring that aid to the ground, whereas Europe then spends a lot of time discussing regulation, and this helps and incentives never get to the companies themselves. And we've seen what happened with the solar panels industry, that now it's 90% dominated by China, with electric cars too. So the question is, how do you see Europe faring in this energy transition, and how it will be positioned in like a decade or two?
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely true to say that there was a lot of, not even panic is too strong a word, in Europe after the IRA in the US was published and passed. A lot of talk about investment shifting across to that side of the Atlantic. I think we still need to really see more details of the European response as it's rolled out and implemented. But I would say for the planet as a whole, it's great to see the competition heating up, in particular between the US, the EU, and China, and other countries besides. This is exactly the kind of race that you would want to see if you were to figure out a model for how the world could really tackle this challenge. I think in terms of the technological base in Europe, I think there are some really sophisticated companies from across the sectors that you need. I think it's really helpful that the European Union has such a well-developed emissions trading system. So in terms of carbon pricing, it's much farther along than either the US or China, of course. And that creates a domestic market where the incentives are to some extent in place to pursue ambitious green agendas. And of course, we'll see as the ETS is expanded and as the free allowances are phased out. That, for example, last week in Sweden, talking to SSAB, which is the steel company pursuing that project. I mean, that was one of the key reasons they gave. They said, we sell in Europe, the cost of carbon is going up, and this is forcing us to change the way that we operate. So I think that's the sophistication of the carbon pricing system is a real strength there, because as it forces these companies to run ahead of their global competitors, it can build a stronger green economy within Europe. I do think at the same time, looking at it from a global level, if Europe is to protect its companies in the face of this more and more ambitious carbon pricing, it's going to have to introduce the CBAM, which we've seen proposed already, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, a tax at the border linked to carbon. And this is driving a lot of concern in a lot of developing countries. The head of the Malaysian Stock Exchange was saying to me a few months ago that in Malaysia, this is back in September actually, so this is before the proposal was even formally published, that Malaysian companies, for example, are getting concerned about this. You will see in terms of this conversation around a just transition, about the costs not falling too heavily on developing countries. I think that's going to be a real hot button issue that the EU might struggle with.
Simon, thank you for that, and particularly thank you for your dedication, your passion to telling this story and doing it in such an engaging way and telling personal stories from all the different spots that you had an opportunity to travel to around the planet. Thank you for being here today. Definitely added value to this conference. Thank you so much. All the best.